Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another Warframe guide. Today, we're going to be looking at Oberon. Oberon is a very interesting frame. Oberon is a versatile, adaptive, support-type frame that has been dubbed a paladin of sorts. Now, Oberon can meet a wide variety of requirements, from healing to buffing, to even having some rather interesting damage being put out, as well as some crowd control. Now, Oberon initially is quite easy to understand with what he does, but he's very hard to master and has, because of that reason, gained a bit of a stigma for being bad because for some reason people seem to relate being hard as being bad. Let's try and dismiss that stigma, shall we, with this guide. If you want to suggest the videos for future guides, leave a comment in the comment section below the video, and maybe possibly drop by our Twitch channel because we record these on our Twitch stream for you to become part of. So feel free to drop by should you ever wish, and join us with what we do, because you dictate how these videos go. Oberon drops are very unique, as they don't drop from an assassination like most other frames. Oberon components come from any Xmas unit, and has a 1% drop chance from any of them. So the more Xmas targets you kill, the more likely you are to get an Oberon piece. And in that 1%, when it does drop, you have a 38.72% chance of the chassis, 38.72% chance of the optics, and a 22.56% chance of a systems. So try to take this in a bit more of a fundamental way, because within about a year of playing the game, and I'm sure any people who've been playing the game for that long will appreciate this sentiment, your inventory is going to be inundated with these blueprints eventually, so get used to having a lot of them in your bags, because you'll be sick of seeing them after a while. The Prime variant of Oberon is not like the regular version. This is obtained like you would obtain any other Prime frame. So in some respects, this can be somewhat easier than getting the regular version. Or you might just get it as you're farming regular Oberon. The parts for Oberon. The blueprint for Prime comes from Leith M3 as an uncommon. The neuroptics come from Leith O1 as a rare. The chassis come from Meso P1 as a common. And the systems come from Axi O4 as a rare. The construction of Oberon. For regular, will set you back 75,000 credits, 2 Oracle cells, 370 alloy plates, 1,650 polymer bundles, 1 control module, 2 gallium, 500 circuits, and 300 rubido. For the Prime variant, it's actually one of the more expensive Prime frames to make in the game, costing you 5 Oracle cells, 2 Nitane extract, 1,500 circuits, 4,000 alloy plates, 3 gallium, 1,250 polymer bundles, 250 plastids, 6,000 nanospores, 100 oxium, 10 control modules, 2 argon crystal, and 1,250 rubido. The stats that Oberon will come with at level 30 for regular Oberon will be 375 health, 300 shields, 150 armor, 150 energy, 1.0 speed, with 2 polarities in the regular mod slots and 1 aura polarity. The Prime variant, there's not much difference, will come with 375 health, 300 shields, 225 armor, and 265 energy, 1.0 speed, and 4 polarities in the regular mod slots, and 1 aura slot. Oberon is a very unique frame. He has a variety of playstyles which can adapt to different situations. And there's a lot of complexity that goes into these sorts of playstyles. But the fundamental of Oberon is he is designed as a support. Oberon is very unique as he can range from buffing your team to healing to dealing large amounts of damage, and it sort of depends on how you want to go about it. But getting that potency out of him is the hard part. There are, in my eyes, 2 ways of playing him. You can either go the support role, which is what most people end up going, or you can go for a more solo-esque tanky playstyle. And first of all, we're going to take a little look at the main playstyle. So, as a main Oberon playstyle, you'll be focusing on using your Hallowed ground with your Renewal to keep your allies healthy, as well as debuffing the enemies that come close. Using a mixture of the radiation damage and the other type of damage types that Oberon does, Oberon has a unique advantage of being able to hold down an area whilst buffing your allies and keeping control of the enemy. Now, in any of these situations, you're never really going to excel in DPS unless you're in very specific situations where radiation damage is effective, as most of your damaging abilities have an innate amount of radiation damage. It's a very specific frame for this sort of requirement of damage. So if you're playing for a supportive playstyle, you're going to be looking at hunkering down in one area and trying to remain as close to your allies as possible to make sure your Renewal is always within range, whilst making sure your Hallowed ground is also affecting as many of your allies as possible for the status immunity and to debuff the enemy. Oberon requires a lot of synergy between abilities and will be very caster heavy, especially with this kind of a playstyle. There is sort of a tangent on rotation of abilities, but in a lot of situations, so long as your buffs are up, that's the important mode, especially with this kind of playstyle. With a more tanky playstyle, you're not so much going to be looking at buffing your allies, although there is still the potency for doing that. Instead, you're going to look at keeping yourself healthy whilst giving yourself as much of a buff as possible. Combining together your Hallowed ground with Renewal generates a buff that gives you bonus armor, which we'll cover more about later, but this in turn will allow you to be quite tanky with the right build. Something that we've mentioned once already is the fact builds are quintessential with Oberon. It's very easy to make a tank playstyle work badly if the build doesn't synergize well with it. So with a tanky playstyle, you're going to be focusing quite heavily on buffing yourself, keeping yourself healthy, and rather than focusing on power strength or anything else that would usually buff your normal abilities, you're going to be focusing more on keeping yourself alive and focusing on the way you play. There is the potency for this kind of a build to work well with solo DPS as well, making use of your Smite, as well as a few of the augments that would work well with that as well. Making use of things like Hunter's Adrenaline in conjunction with Quick Thinking can also work very well with keeping Oberon healthy, as he does have innate amounts of good survivability within his kit as it is. Something to realize about Oberon: he's a jack of all trades. So you're never really going to stick with one specific playstyle, and he will adapt to what works for the situation you're in. You will need to look at the playstyles you like playing with, and you'll need to find the way you personally prefer playing Oberon. But you should always realize that the build will be the important factors to how he works. A bad build will make a bad Oberon, but in the right hands, an Oberon can be fundamentally one of the strongest utility and buffing frames within Warframe. So play him properly and play him right, and you'll have one of the most potent frames in the game. Oberon's passive is quite a boring one, really, but it's quite useful to know what it does. Oberon's passive is called Beastmaster, which allows Kubros and Kavats to receive a plus 25% health, shield, and armor link, so that those links will become more potent than without Oberon. The player's Kubro or Kavat will also additionally receive one extra revive per mission, so if they do fall down for whatever reason, you may not get a pissed animal trying to moan at you afterwards. Something to realize is, unfortunately, mowers do not benefit from this buff, however, so you will probably want to focus more on having actual animals with you rather than machinery. Smite is Oberon's 1. Smite is a projectile much like Ember's Flame Blast ability from her 1 as well. It's a projectile that will hit an enemy within 50 meters and deal 500 damage while knocking them down and applying a radiation proc. The damage distribution, oddly enough, is a split between impact damage, 50% of it, and 50% radiation damage. Which is kind of weird in a sense, because it's a very differing type of damage, which means different enemies will be resistant to it in different fashions, so it's a bit of a weird one. But because it's radiation, it'll be good for crowd control and causing enemies to squabble amongst themselves like so, but it also means that with the puncture as well as the radiation, it'll be very good versus high alloy plate armored enemies, as well as robotics and infested. Making use of the puncture and radiation is probably the best way to go with this. Although it will never really deal a substantial amount of damage, it is situationally very good, especially with the passive. Additionally, the target that is initially hit with this blast will then shoot 6 orbs that will then seek out the closest enemy within 12.5 meters from the main target. These will then seek out for up to 12 seconds, and each orb individually deals 150 radiation damage plus 35% of the main target's maximum health. Because of this, you want to prioritize shooting this onto the toughest enemy possible. So as a bar fight would always say, go for the biggest guy first. And then that will then deal more damage to the subsequent targets afterwards. The orbs that are generated will stagger and cause puncture damage, thus weakening the target they affect. So not only is this good for crowd control, but it also weakens the enemies you're fighting as well. The amount of orbs generated, as well as the damage of the initial cast and the orbs generated, is affected by power strength. the range in which they seek and the range in the cast is affected by ability range. Because of all this, using Smite around large groups of enemies allows the damage to scale exponentially with power strength, and it's good for keeping constant crowd control whilst allowing the enemies to fight amongst each other. Having the puncture to then weaken enemies, as well as everything else, makes Smite a very useful ability, especially with some of the augments you'll be using later. Smite Infusion is the augment for Smite. Casting this on allies will add 100% radiation damage to their attacks. So if initially their attacks are quite weak, like good old Gibibbi here, if you would kindly shoot, good sir. Look at that pitiful damage. Look at it! So pitiful and weak. If we just move away to cast this ability on Gibibbi so they don't get affected by the radiation orbs, this is something to keep in mind. Casting it on your allies will still cause the balls to then be sent out. The player then gets the 100% bonus radiation damage, which will then make a significant difference in the amount of damage they then deal. Quite the damage dealer, if I do say so myself. Oberon's 2 is Hallowed Ground. This creates an area of ground in an angle of 180 degrees in front of him. This then spans for up to 15 meters for 20 seconds. Enemies standing in the area effect are dealt 100 radiation damage with a 15% radiation status chance every half a second, with allies becoming immune to status effects and getting cleansed of any effects they then have, so long as they are standing within the area. This is great for holding down an area, as well as buffing allies and making enemies take small amount of damage, which will then work in synergy with other abilities. Very good if you know there are lots of. This is very good if you know there are lots of special units around, like napalms or enemies that can trigger lots of status effects, like the toxin throwers or Eximuses, or anything that can then cause really annoying status effects that would normally let you die almost instantly, as well as also being passively quite good for low levels as well. A little tidbit that's worth knowing about the angle in which Hallowed Ground projects itself at. Building range will increase the radius in which this goes out around you. Building for 235% range will give you a 360% radius of effect with the Hallowed Ground. The damage and status chance of Hallowed Ground are affected by ability strength. The duration is affected by ability duration. And, as already been said, the radius is affected by range, as well as the distance it then travels. So hitting that butter zone of 235% range will make the most use of Hallowed Ground. In advice sort of standing, you would want to use this in narrow chokes to take advantage of enemies that would be walking through, as well as also putting it down onto defensible areas, such as if you're in a defense mission or mobile defense. Another useful tidbit as well is the fact that more than one instance of Hallowed Ground can be active at any given time, which allows the instances of damage as well as radiation procs to stack on top of each other. So if you have two Oberons, for example, you can then stack those radiation procs as well as the beneficial status immunity as well, which then makes it even better for dealing lots and lots of lovely radiation damage to the enemy. And this again works in conjunction with something we'll be talking about in a moment with Oberon's 3 as well as his 1. The augment for Hallowed Ground is called Hallowed Eruption. When you have Hallowed Ground down already, when you activate Hallowed Ground again, it will consume the Hallowed Ground, dealing the remaining damage in a burst with a 100% rad proc, which allows you to deal a large amount of spike damage, considering the passivity of this ability as it is. So adding a bit of extra damage, this probably won't work too amazingly in higher level missions, but that guaranteed rad proc is pretty damn nice, and especially seeing as you can cast this pretty frequently, especially with natural talent on. This could be something that's quite worth using for lower levels, and seeing as Hallowed Ground has one of the most effective range scaling with range mods as any ability in the game, you can, in theory, have a very powerful ability for farming low-level missions, or potentially even just running through a mission and just blasting down Hallowed Ground and destroying everything as they go through. Not to mention the guaranteed rad proc is also extremely useful for creating crowd control and confusion. Renewal is Oberon's 3. Renewal is a heal of sorts. Oberon basically creates a field around him with a 25-meter radius, which is permanent until deactivated. Ally players entering the field will receive a buff which will regenerate 40 health every second, while allied summoned units will regenerate 13.3 health every second for as long as Renewal remains active, regardless of range. Fully healed allies are additionally also cleared of all negative status effects, much like the 2. Incapacitated allies will also bleed out slower, and this bleed out duration is affected by ability duration, allowing you much longer chance to get them back up. Now, here's the useful part. If Oberon's allies are affected by Renewal and stand on hallowed ground, they will gain a buff. This buff is an armor buff called Iron Renewal. This grants 200 bonus armor, and the buff itself is affected by power strength. The more power strength you have, the bigger this buff becomes. Now, the more allies that are affected by Renewal, the faster drain on your energy there will be. Something useful to know is that pets that are affected by this essentially gain a second version of the buff, meaning they essentially get 2 times the armor buff, which makes pets even stronger. Now, the heal over time and the potency of Iron Renewal, as is already mentioned, is affected by ability strength. The radius that your aura affects is affected by ability range, and the duration of the Iron Renewal, for the most part, is affected by ability duration. The best advice here is to always make sure you combine this with Hallowed Grounds and your Renewal. Have them both up at any given time to gain the biggest benefit possible. Phoenix Renewal is the augment for Renewal. This acts as a lifeline, causing you not to die should you take fatal damage. Instead, reviving you with 50% health. However, this proc can only happen once every 90 seconds. So, we're going to give Gabibi this lovely little buff. We're going to unpause the AI, and now Gabibi's going to run out like a madman and hopefully die, and show you the potency of this buff. So, Gabibi, get your butt out here. Quick as you can, please. And there he goes. And that proc should then allow him to hopefully revive, assuming he's taking enough damage. This is the time where Gabibi's survivability comes into play. And behold, he doesn't die! Hallelujah! It's a miracle! No, wait, it's just a very useful augment. Hallelujah! Reckoning! That beautiful name. Oberon's Reckoning is an ability that will lift enemies within 15 meters into the air and violently slam them down into the ground like a really bad mosh pit. This deals 1,250 damage, applying a knockdown and a guaranteed radiation proc. Additionally, Reckoning deals 625 extra damage to enemies affected by radiation effect. So, using your other radiation abilities, you can in turn use this in synergy to deal bonus, rather excess amounts of damage. Because of the combination effect with radiation, this works well with Smite, Hallowed Ground, as well as also any weapon that would deal radiation damage as well. So synergizing maybe with Arcoplasm would be a good idea here. In addition, this is also another very useful form of crowd control. So if your Smite maybe isn't doing it enough, or maybe your other radiation procs aren't causing the enemy to fight each other enough, having Reckoning bring a Reckoning down upon them to then stun and knock down can be an additional form of crowd control should things be getting out of control. The damage is not that bad either, and especially for lower levels, this will be extremely useful, especially with the range scaling. Something you'll be quite quickly notice is that Oberon's range potential is huge. He has one of the best range scalings of any frame in the game, especially with the potency of the abilities therein. The damage of Reckoning is 50% radiation and 50% impact. Make note of those stats. Again, much like Smite, it's a bit weird in how there's a split between status types here, as it'll mean again that there's this weird resistance crossover where certain enemies are going to be weak to one but not the other. It's a bit weird, which is kind of just a good way of explaining Oberon, honestly. Affected enemies that survive the impact will emit an intense flash of light, blinding surrounding enemies within a 4-meter radius that were unaffected by the initial cast for 4 seconds. Additionally, if surviving targets were standing on hallowed ground when affected by Reckoning, their armor is permanently reduced by 30%. So, again, another sign of synergy between abilities. The damage and armor reduction of this are affected by power strength. The cast radius and blind radius are affected by range. The duration of the blind is affected by duration. And again, the bonus damage of radiation is any enemy affected by radiation is just going to take more damage. And because you're usually going to have them on the hallowed ground initially anyway, that bonus radiation damage is going to be there pretty much right off the bat. This is one of the more potent abilities you are likely to use with Oberon, and it's often what a lot of newer players to Oberon fall back on because it's so simple and so easy to use, and even with like a really blasé build, you'll end up doing a substantial amount of damage. So if you're just getting into Oberon and you want to learn him in a fundamental way, rely on your 4 whilst dabbling with the other abilities. The augment for Reckoning is called Hallowed Reckoning. Enemies affected by Reckoning spawn zones that increase armor by 250 for allies and inflict 150 damage to enemies stood within them. These appear as these little swirly vortexes that you can stand in, which will then give you that lovely buff. The duration of this is affected by ability duration, and the potency of it is affected by power strength. So, not a very amazing augment, but it does give a bit of extra utility should you want to add to that buff potential that you get with Oberon. So as stated at the start of the video, Oberon is a very diverse frame that has a lot of unique playstyles, and because of which, he has a lot of different build types. And the build you go for should often be dictated by your preference and playstyle. However, the build that I'm using here has been used by multiple different streamers and YouTubers, and it's something that I have personally tested to be quite useful. Now, Phoenix, Renewal, Quick Thinking, they work a little bit weirdly against each other, but at lower level missions they do work quite nicely for keeping you alive. So long as Renewal is activated, you will then have that proc where you just get revived to 50% health, and then Quick Thinking will help keep you alive thereafter. Bearing in mind that there is that stagger when Quick Thinking does get triggered, however. So it's entirely down to your prerogative. My advice is use Phoenix Renewal. If you don't like the way these two work in synergy, replace Phoenix Renewal for Vitality, Steel Fiber. It's entirely up to you. With this build, you're looking at power strength to make sure you make the most use of your damage, things like Smite, and the buffs you then generate for yourself. This is more of a solo type build that helps you play with a solo playstyle, whilst also making use of survivability. You want continuity to make the buffs last longer, and the aura mod in any of these builds, as with most builds you go for, is subjective to what you find works well. Growing power is usually quite a good aura mod for Oberon, but it's, again, personal preference with this. The second build is more focused towards CC and healing, in place of Hallowed Reckoning or any of the augments that would be used with Hallowed Ground, or your Reckoning, or your Renewal. You could then replace this with survivability, with anything that from Quick Thinking, to anything of that nature. This, in general, is to make the most use of your Renewal, Renewal, Hallowed Ground, and Reckoning, giving the biggest radius possible. You would also not be mistaken for rejecting Reach in place of an augment. As I stated previously, things like Hallowed Ground need 235% range to get a max coverage. Any additional range after that is based purely on the radius that the Hallowed Ground then reach outwards from there. So you could in theory replace Augur Reach with an augment and then put Quick Thinking or Vitality in place of Hallowed Reckoning. It's entirely down to your prerogative, but that butter zone of 235% range is very useful when you're trying to make a build of this nature. The second build we're looking at is more focused on the support and healing. This is going to focus on trying to get up to that butter zone of 235% range to make the Hallowed Ground reach in a 360 degree angle around your body. You can go beyond that to allow that the radius of your Hallowed Ground and Renewal to get further. However, it's not 100% needed, and you could, in theory, replace either Augur Reach or Cunning Drift with something else to make your ability slightly stronger. Again, having a baseline bit of power strength up to 125% is quite useful to make your buff stronger, whilst healing a lot more efficiently as well. Steel Fiber could in theory be replaced with Quick Thinking should you like that kind of playstyle, and Augur Reach or Stretch would be my recommendation to replace for one of the augments. This is a build that works incredibly well with any of the augments that are benefacted by range, such as Phoenix Renewal, Hallowed Reckoning, or Hallowed Eruption. Making use of this is probably one of the more support type builds you'll go for, and it's incredibly good, especially for more open maps as well as holding down a location. The third build, this one is a very good Eidolon build as well as a general single player build, which will deal quite a substantial amount of damage on your Smite or your Reckoning should enemies get close enough. With this, you are focusing on Smite Infusion. This, as mentioned earlier, is a massive radiation buff to your ally, and especially for Eidolons who are weak to radiation, this buff in particular will give you a massive, massive radiation benefit. The build focuses purely around as much power strength as possible. Getting upwards of 290% power strength is ideal here. And then you want some duration to make this last a bit longer, and a bit more survivability. Again, Steel Fiber, as with any of these builds, because Oberon is very energy efficient and has a lot of energy initially. Replacing any of the survivability mods with a quick thinking could be a good choice here. The power strength is what works for this build though. Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you found this Oberon guide useful. Oberon is a very unique frame, and it's a frame that I have a lot of fun with. Take some time to learn him, because he can give a lot of fun playstyles. And, you know, if you have liked this video, I am planning to make a lot of changes to the way I do videos in the future. We've got new editing software. I'm changing the sort of mannerisms that I make with the guides themselves, making it a bit more informative. By comparison to the first guides we did, holy hell, these things are by far and away better than the first guides I did. Speaking of the first guides, keep an eye out, because we are going to be revisiting a lot of our very first guides, going back to look at Rhino, Limbo, those sorts of things. Because the way that we've done these guides has changed quite dramatically. A lot of those older guides don't really meet my standard these days, so we're going to go back and take a look at them. So keep an eye out for that. And of course, if you have liked this video, if you want to maybe comment on what things I could improve on, as well as things you would like to see in the future, leave a comment down below. Leave a like if you liked the video, or don't if you didn't. And subscribe if you like to see more. And again, if you want to come and join us, we do record these on our Twitch as well. There'll be a link to that in the description. Hopefully see all of you top hatters in the next video, and I'll catch you all later. Ta-ra!